Good morning Year 6, it's Tuesday the 2nd of March and our learning objective is to write effective sentences for our balanced argument. So we're on to day 2 today of our sentence stacking lessons and we're going to continue with the next stage. So here's our success criteria today. We're going to have 3 sentences just like we did yesterday. This will be the same for every sentence stacking lesson that we do now. So in the first sentence we're going to use a relative clause and that is to do with our sentence structure. So we've got that symbol for sentence structure. We're then going to use a quote. So we've got our fantastic there, which is our speech bubble for our speech. And we've also got the punctuation symbol there because we will obviously be using inverted commas for our quote. In our third sentence, again, we will be looking at adverbs and formal language. So we've got our symbol there for our adverbials. So today we'll be looking at our senior view and our agree statements. Okay, so make sure you've got those ones in front of you. So we're on chunk 1 and we are going to initiate. So we're going to build up our ideas. And remember, our first part of our success criteria was our relative clause. So the first thing I want you to think about to build up your ideas is what are the jobs of a head teacher? Write 3 relative clauses to describe this. So start your relative clause with whose job it is to. Okay, so you're just thinking about that relative clause. So, you know, there'd be a bit before it, so it might say the head teacher whose job it is to, and then the sentence would carry on. So it would be the bit that you would have in brackets, in commas, okay, giving that extra information. So here are some examples that I've come up with. So you might have the head teacher whose job it is to maintain discipline, the head teacher whose job it is to improve exam results, the head teacher whose job it is to ensure progress, the head teacher whose job it is to raise standards. So those are some examples that I've come up with the jobs of the head teacher and what they do. You might have some more. If you need some ideas, add those to your list. So in the second part of the initiate stage, I wanted you to think about what outcomes head teachers might fear from too much screen time. So I've given you 3 examples here. I've said that they might have a deteriorating social skills, the children might have reduced concentration, and they might have declining attainment, so how well they're succeeding in school. So I want you to have a think, is there anything else that you think head teachers might say? Think back to what Mrs. Coulson was saying on Friday. So we're now moving on to the modelling section of chunk 1, thinking about our relative clause. So here is my example. The majority of head teachers, whose job it is to ensure pupil well-being, are concerned about the impacts of screen use on children's academic abilities and learning behaviours. So you can see there that I've got my relative clause, and you can see where it says about children's academic abilities and learning behaviours. That is what I would have come up with in the initiate stage for what head teachers believe and how it affects the children. So we're looking at chunk 1 and we're thinking about enabling. So we're going to enable you to write your own sentence using a relative clause. So in your first sentence you need to include formal language and you need to include a relative clause. So use my example to help you and write your own sentence. So we're now moving on to chunk 2 and we're going to initiate again and we're going to think about using a quote. So I want you to think, we're going to use a quote from a head teacher. So you will have had a quote from Mrs. Coulson. However, I don't want you to write Mrs. Coulson said. I want you to think, can you come up with a good pun for their name? So let's have a look at some examples that I've got. So I've got Miss Detention, Miss Assembly, Miss A Break, Mr. Standards, Miss D Bell, Mr. Writer. So I want you to come up with something that just gives a bit of humour to your writing and show that you've actually really thought about it. So we should be really good at this by now because we have talked about this when writing stories and things. The second part of the initiate stage, I want you to think of alternatives to says. So rather than saying Mrs. Coulson says or Mr. Coulson said, what else could you use? So here are some examples. So I've got states, suggests, argues, stresses. So you might have come up with some more. When you are looking at your list, think about which ones are suitable. So we don't want shouted or whispered. Those are for a story, they're not for a balanced argument. So think about, maybe circle from the ones that you've got, which ones are actually suitable. So chunk 2 for modelling, here's my model. So be looking for my quote and my punctuation that goes with it when I'm reading. So Missy Brake, who chairs the East Midlands Association of Head Teachers, argues time on screens is making children lazy and having a negative effect on learning. So you can see there I've got my quote and I've got my inverted commas around it. So in the enable stage, your sentence should include a head teacher quote and use an appropriate pun for their name. Okay, so I'm trying to make this really enjoyable for the writer. I want to have a little giggle to myself when I'm reading the name. So our third chunk is thinking about adverbs and formal language. So for our initiate stage, to gain our ideas, I want you to think, can you think of some adverbs which show frequency for nearly always? So if I was going to say that something nearly always happens, what adverbs could you use for that? And here are some examples if you weren't sure, or you can add them to your list. So if something nearly always happens, I might say it usually happens, it often happens, it generally or it commonly happens, it normally happens or it mostly happens. So all those things tell me that it nearly always happens. So add those to your list if you don't have them already. So the second part of our initiate stage, I want you to think, can you think of some synonyms for unrestricted? You might find this a little bit tricky. If you want to use Google or a thesaurus, you can do. But for the word unrestricted, think about what that means first and what other synonyms are there for it. So here are some examples. We've got unlimited, because if it's unrestricted, it means it's unlimited. You can do it whatever you want, as much as you want. It's infinite, it's endless, it's limitless, it's boundless, it's never ending, it's open-ended. So some examples there to help you. To initiate the next stage, I want you to think about what type of things might you struggle with when you're tired. So just make a list, think about when you are tired, what things do you struggle with, what do you find difficult? And here are some examples that I came up with. So you might find it difficult to concentrate, to focus, to interact socially with somebody. You might find it hard to stay awake, to complete your homework, and to make progress. So you could add those to your list if you'd like. And here's my model for chunk 3. So I'm starting it with often, so that's my adverbial. Often, children who spend unrestricted amounts of time on screens struggle to focus, interact socially, and stay awake. So for chunk 3, when you're writing your sentence, I want it to start with an adverb. So look back at your list, which one could you choose? I want you to include a synonym for unrestricted. So again, look back at your list and choose one. And then I want you to list 3 issues that tired children have. So if you look back at my last slide, mine starts with an adverb, I use the word unrestricted, and then I list 3 things that children find hard. So you're doing exactly the same, but just slightly changing those words.